All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. So today we'll be talking about how we deal with some of our rendering techniques in our sandbox games at Frontier Developments. So we're going to start off by providing a bit of an overview of who we are and what we are about and what our games are about and some of the complexities that we have to deal with, and a bit of an explanation of why we can and can't use certain optimizations. After that, we'll go into 3 different case studies where we'll talk a bit more in depth about some of the techniques that we use and the reasoning behind that. Well, first of all, who am I? So my name is Gert Tanens, or Gert more commonly referred to as, and I am a principal render programmer at Frontier Developments. I've been in the industry for almost 8 years now, 7 of which has been at Frontier Developments. I started off working on projects on Planet Zoo and Jurassic World Evolution, though the last couple of years I've moved on to do more engine development and more specifically large-scale architecturing in the rendering systems of our engine, as well as doing platform support. So who is Frontier Developments? So we are a self-published studio of about 900 people these days. So we specialize in simulation and management games, with games such as Elite Dangerous, Planet Coaster, Planet Zoo, the Jurassic World Evolution series, as well as the Formula One Manager series, and now Warhammer Age of Sigmar Realms of Ruin as well. So today I will be mostly talking about Planet Zoo and Jurassic World Evolution 2, as that's where the most interesting case subjects are for what I'm talking about today. So what you see here is a fly-through of a park created by one of our well-known players, Delay Designer. This is in Planet Zoo. So what you can see here is how the players can really build their own parks, build their own zoos. They have to take care of the animal well-being, while at the same time we give them a lot of creativity and a lot of modularity to build their own buildings and really pushing the limit of what our games are all about. So a lot of this creative freedom in these games and how they can build these parks and all that type of stuff, it does not come for free. It results in a lot of our systems having to deal with all these technical issues and all these technical complexities in a wide range of all of our systems, such as physics, simulation, audio, rendering, you name it, we have to deal with it. But today we'll be talking mostly about the rendering ones. So let's start off with the first big one, geometry. So in Jurassic World Evolution, our players build their parks by placing down buildings within the world and kind of build their own park and place down the buildings wherever they want. So that's already the first issue, because these buildings, the scene, we don't know what it looks like because the player is the ones creating it. But in our Planet series games, such as Planet Zoo, we go even a step further and we allow them to create the buildings themselves. So we expose all of these small little modular individual pieces, and these players can build these buildings out of these pieces and then stamp those all across the world in different ways that they want. So for instance, in this video here, you can see that this building actually consists out of 965 individual little pieces that the player all hand placed within the world. So you can imagine what that means for any of the geometric complexity within our games. Similarly as well, we even have got other systems on top of this for runtime generated meshes. For instance, the fences around animal barriers, like around animal habitats in Planet Zoos, or the habitats where you place your dinosaurs in the Jurassic World Evolution series, as well as, for instance, the roller coasters in the Planet Coaster series. Those are all runtime generated meshes as well. Now, of course, terrain. Terrain is another big one. Not only do we allow players to build these pieces and build these buildings wherever they want, we even allow them to modify the terrain on which they are building these pieces onto. So we expose a full terrain editor that allows them to raise, lower, paint materials on the terrain. And in our Planet series, we even go as far as to allow them to do tunneling within the terrain as well. For any of you who have worked on terrain systems before, I'm sure you can imagine the extra complexities that tunnel brings to a terrain system. Now, We also allow them to, for instance, paint water bodies and things like that, so they can place water in the world. That all has to interact with this terrain as well. And then the third big thing is, of course, lighting. Our games have got fully dynamic day-night cycles with lighting as well that are even player controllable. So the player gets a time slider that they can choose. Do I want to go from day to night, specific timings? They can choose what they want. But on top of that, with the lighting as well, is that we've often even got other systems that modify the lighting as well, such as, for instance, various different weather systems like rain, snow, or in the Jurassic World series, tornadoes and things like that. So the lighting all has to deal with these different systems as well. Now, that's, of course, not where the complexities end. There's a lot more at play. Those were just three of the biggest ones. As I've already mentioned, large object count is a big one because our players can build their own parks. We don't limit how many things they can place in the world. We have seen parks go as high as 1 million objects within a single world. So our systems have to deal with all of that. There's the crowd simulation and the rendering of the crowds. So these parks are dynamic, but of course in Planet Coaster, Planet Zoo, Jurassic World Evolution, the crowd moves towards this as well. So pathfinding of all those things, and how do you deal with rendering 10,000 crowd members on top of a fully dynamic scene as well. And close far camera angles, the player can zoom both really close to the game as well as have a really far high level overview of the game. And then, of course, procedural animation of all of our animals and dinosaurs and things like that interacting with the world. So those are only a couple of examples of all the complexities we have to deal with. And all of this, of course, has to be done on an engine that supports multiple platforms, PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. So now what does this mean for any of the optimizations that we do? So the first obvious big one is, of course, baking is very hard for us. Doing any type of offline baking is usually out of the question because, again, the world is created by the user. We don't know upfront what the user is going to create, so we can't bake it. The second big one is temporal accumulation. So temporal accumulation, any type of temporal accumulation that accumulates over only a couple of frames is usually fine. But any type of temporal accumulation that accumulates over a large amount of frames, such as, for instance, certain global illumination techniques, we have to be very careful with because, again, the user is constantly changing the scene, the lighting is constantly changing, the terrain is changing. We would often spend more time calculating when to invalidate all of these baked systems than it would be to just do it at real time anyways. Anything that scales off of geometric complexity is usually a bad idea for us. As I said, we don't limit how many things the player can place down. So we could be dealing with a park of a player that tends to focus more on the simulation side, where they may not have that many things. Or we could be dealing with a player who tends to focus more on the creative side, where they would be placing down insane amounts of objects in this world. As I said, over 1 million possible objects in the world. Anything that scales with geometric complexity, we just can't possibly optimize for that. Target hardware, of course, the big obvious one. If you're dealing with console, you have a very limited set of memory. You can't just tell the user to upgrade their machine to get more memory. That's just not a possibility. So how do we fit all of this in memory? How do we make sure that all of these entities in the world don't start using up all of our memory? And how do we deal with that across the various different platforms that we support? And of course, aiming for a consistent experience on all platforms. We want to, because we do both PC, Xbox, and PlayStation, we want to have everybody to have a somewhat similar experience as far as the platform allows it, of course. Any type of technique that tends to be significantly faster on one platform as opposed to another platform is not really a technique that is fit for us. It also means that it's just yet another technique that we have to take into account, that we have to optimize for all these various different permutations and complexity. So we tend to prefer techniques that have got more of a consistent performance characteristic across all of the platforms that we support. Now, To make all of this possible, we've got our own in-house engine. So this is the Cobra engine. So unlike certain off-the-shelf engines, we've got full control over all the various systems, how we deal with those, and really can fine-tune our engine to the types of games that we make. It really allows us to tailor it to our specific needs, and really, you can see it's a bit more of a special type of game, so it makes sense for us to implement our own logic. It is primarily a C++ based engine, with some parts of it, mostly the gameplay parts, implemented in Lua, but the bulk of the engine is implemented in C++ to really get that last little bit of performance out of it. It is a entity component based engine, but as I alluded to before, 1 million entities within the world with components. So as you can imagine, we tend to focus a lot on multi-threaded entity component management and a lot of very cache-aware programming for our entities. Because if you have a component manager, for instance, like your transform component that exists on 1 million entities within your world, you probably want to spread the processing of that over a couple of threads and really be cache-aware and stuff like that. And all of this is, of course, implemented on top of our own platform abstraction layers, supporting PC in both current and previous generation of PlayStation and Xbox consoles. And we've got our own in-house department that maintains this engine, called the Shared Technology Group, or STG for short, which is what I am part of. Okay, now let's move on to some more specific examples. So for our first thing, we're going to be looking at how we do shadows. So the main technique we use for our shadows is cascaded shadow maps. This is not any revolutionary new techniques. This is a widely used technique for shadowing. It works well. We use a collection of multiple cascades, usually 3 or 4 cascades, depending on platform or quality setting of the user. And all of these are centered around the camera and are updated based off of the camera frustum across frames. Now, one common optimization that you'll often see for cascaded shadow maps is to effectively time splice the rendering of the cascades. What do I mean with that? You'll often see engines render cascade 0 and 1 frame, and then the next frame render cascade 0, 2, and 3, and then constantly ping pong between those two. This is often because you want your cascade 0, which is your closest to the camera cascade, to have the highest detail, have the highest quality level, and be as up to date as possible. And the cost of rendering cascade 1 is quite often similar to the cost of rendering cascade 2 and 3, because you tend to have lower detail objects in cascade 2 and 3 because they cover the more distant objects within your scenes. However, in our case, we can't do that. Why not? So if you think about how our games can render both really close and really far, and how we have no control over what the user is placing in the world, we can't rely on that guarantee that the cost of cascade 1 and the cost of cascade 2 and 3 is going to be somewhat similar. Nor can we actually rely that cascade 0 is going to have the shadows of the thing that the user is currently looking at, because they could be looking up close, in which case we care more about cascade 0, or they could be looking from really far, in which case we care more about cascade 3. So trying to split that rendering over multiple frames just doesn't really work for us. So we tend to just re-render all cascades every frame and just optimize for the worst case scenario and have a consistent experience for all this. If we wouldn't do that, we would tend to have frame spikes between frames, and you would have your frame rate constantly ping pong. It is far better to have a slightly lower frame rate than to have a frame rate that consistently ping pongs, because the user will notice the spikes significantly more than they will notice a lower consistent frame rate. Now, a second big thing that you have to be careful with cascaded shadow maps, or shadow maps in general, is the area that your shadow maps span. Your shadow maps, you are effectively rendering a specific resolution, which basically means that every single pixel within your shadow map takes up a certain area within the world. The larger area you try to make your shadow map span, the less detail you can have within your shadow maps. Now, in our games, we have the concept of what we call the playable area. What is the playable area? It is the region that the player can actually modify the terrain, place buildings, paths, stuff like that, the actual, playable area. But often a lot of our worlds have got a lot of geometry outside of the playable area as well. If you think, for instance, about our Jurassic World Evolution series, you often have the playable area surrounded by these large mountains and things like that. Combine that with the fact that we've got a fully dynamic day-night cycle where you can have both like midday lighting, but you can also have, for instance, a dusk lighting as well. You want those terrain to cast really nice shadows over your playable area because, you want the terrain on the outside of the world to really feel part of your world and not just some background geometry. But if we would increase the area that our cascaded shadow maps span, it would either be significantly too expensive to render, or we would not have enough detail in our shadow maps, but we still want that detail. So in this screenshot here, you can, for instance, see the cyan bit is what our cascaded shadow map spans. Everything that is in red does not have any shadowing information for our cascaded shadow maps. So how do we get that extra information? Simple, a second shadow map. So we have a secondary shadowing technique that we use to encompass this larger area. And for this, we use variant shadow maps. Now, what are variant shadow maps is, instead of having a shadow map that is just simply depth that you can do depth comparisons again, it is a two-component shadow map that holds depth and depth squared that allows you to run it through a very clever formula and effectively get an idea of a chance of shadowing as opposed to a simple occlusion of shadow as well. The downside of this technique is that you get significantly less detail in the shadow because you get less detail in these shadows because you don't have as sharp, because of the fact that it's more of a chance-based approach as opposed to an actual occlusion. But again, we use this to get the general information of our surrounding area, so that's fine. So this cascaded shadow map, we render this for a significantly larger area. So where you compare it to the previous screenshot, you can now see anything in green is encompassed by our cascaded shadow maps. Anything in red still doesn't have shadows. Another advantage of variant shadow maps over other shadowing techniques is because of the fact that it's depth and depth squared, you can do filtering on it. So you can kind of hide even a bit more of that lack of detail, get a bit more smoother shadows for your rougher areas by doing some kind of bilinear filtering, doing some kind of blur pass. You can do all kinds of things with it. Now, because it also has a significantly coarser detail, because again, we're only rendering the terrain in these variant shadow maps because we only care about this outside area of the shadows. The amount of change in lighting that you need to have before you can see a change in your shadowing is significantly more. What this means is that we can split this shadow rendering across multiple frames because it's going to take significantly longer for the directional to actually change. So we tend to split the variant shadow map rendering over 4 frames and just reaccumulate every single frame. Now let's give some examples here. So this is, for instance, a scene from Jurassic World Evolution 2. On the left here, it's got the lighting currently set coming from that big mountain you see in the background, so a dusk scenario. So on the left here, you can see the playable area does not have any kind of shadowing information at all. Shadows are disabled. On the right, you can see what happens if we enable cascaded shadows. So we get some of the information from our cascaded shadow maps for the playable area that is encompassed, but you see a lot of gaps on the left and the right of the playable area that you would expect to be occluded by the terrain, but actually aren't occluded at all. If we compare that to variance shadows, so on the left, again, no shadows, on the right, variant shadows, you can see how you have a lot more shadowing information in your playable area of that terrain casting that shadow. But you also notice how in the more front of the screenshot, there is actually a significant amount of overshadowing happening. This is because the variant shadow maps are significantly less detailed and significantly less resolution than the cascaded shadow maps. So how do we deal with that? Simple, we combine them. So every single frame, we run a screen space shadow collection pass where based off of the depth buffer for each point in the world, we can figure out, does this point have information in the cascaded shadow maps? If so, use that information. If it doesn't, try to see if it has information in the variant shadow maps. If it does, we now have shadow. With these two combined, you get that detail of the cascaded shadow maps in the regions that the detail is available, but you have the variant shadow maps filling in all of these gaps that you would normally expect there to be shadowing information. There's actually more you can do with the variant shadow maps as well. Because it's such a low resolution map, it allows you to get a general idea of lighting occlusion within your scene. So here, for instance, you can see an example of our atmospherics. So we use a dynamic atmospheric system that uses a volume accumulation screen space. So on the left, you can see how the atmospherics, the extinction of the light, is bleeding through that mountain because it isn't aware that that mountain is actually occluding the light of the sun. But because we have this variant shadow map as kind of like a low resolution fallback occlusion method, we can just do a simple single tap within our screen space accumulation and get our atmospherics to be properly occluded by the mountains as well. And this again really helps place those mountains that are technically background geometry, really place them within the worlds and make them feel as if they're really part of the worlds because it's interacting with all of the various lighting systems. Now, let's move on to our second case study, which is occlusion and perturbation. So one of our first occlusion techniques that we use is a height variance map. Again, variance maps, I'm not going to explain it again, depth squares. It's the same idea as with the shadowing techniques. However, this time, instead of trying to get an idea of the occlusion from the directional light, we try to get an idea of the occlusion of the terrain. Why do we use a variance map for this? It allows us to use a lower resolution map and again, get a chance of occlusion as opposed to just a simple single binary comparison. We actually don't render this one GPU side. We actually render this one CPU side by sampling the height terrain, the height map data CPU side or the voxel terrain data CPU side. This data already exists CPU side anyways because of the fact that we have a dynamic terrain system. So we might as well just sample it there. We primarily use this to occlude any kind of indirect lighting for our games that allow for tunneling and things like that. So this is primarily our diffuse image-based lighting, as well as any of our ambient occlusion, to really sell that idea of you are in a tunnel, there is no indirect light coming into here. Here you see an example of height variance disabled on the left and height variance enabled on the right. So you can really see the darkening within these tunnels and selling that idea. But there's actually a more fun application of the height variance map. Because this data exists CPU side, this means that we now also have got a rough approximation of occlusion chance CPU side within our, that can be used by our gameplay systems. So our players can place down lights in the world as well, and they can often set these lights to automatic. What does automatic mean? The lights are off during the day and the lights are on during the night. However, if the user places down a light within a tunnel or within a cave, you would kind of expect the light to turn on. So we can sample this height variance map and get a simple idea of how much chance there is of this light existing within a cave and automatically turn the light on or off to once again sell the idea that the light is part of the world and is interacting with the world. One of our second occlusion techniques is precipitation occlusion. So I've already mentioned that we've got weather systems in our games, such as rain and snow and things like that. Because the user can build the terrain and can build all these buildings, we don't want snow or rain to end up within these buildings. We wanted to sell the idea that they are properly occluding, either for the crowd members that are running around within the world or the animals or the dinosaurs, and get the idea of shelter. So for this, we render an occlusion map. What is this occlusion map? Is the basic idea of it is that it's a top-down map that renders everything that we think can possibly occlude any type of precipitation. But if you think about rain or snow, it doesn't tend to just fall straight down. It gets affected by wind. So what we actually do is, instead of only rendering just a single top-down occlusion texture, we render it from 3 other slightly diagonal directions as well to kind of have the inset of the occlusion as well. You could say that you could just take this top-down occlusion texture and do a simple blur on it to kind of get that inset in any of the opening of the buildings. But that would result in any of the occlusion also bleeding into the buildings. So if you have a building with a wall, some snow would bleed through it, and we don't want that. So as with the shadows for the precipitation occlusion, we run another screen space collection pass that basically accumulates these 4 different directional textures, and for every single point in the world, calculates an occlusion value. This is significantly cheaper than trying to sample all of these directions for every single pixel in your pixel shader, and allows our material effects that actually apply the snow and the rain effects to just have a single point that they can sample from. But there's another fun thing we can do with that. So within Planet Zoo, the player has to build these habitats for their animals. But these animals have got different requirements for their habitats. Some like it a bit warmer, some like it a bit colder. So the player actually has to place down coolers and heaters within the world in order to ensure that the needs from their animals are met. We actually use this data and upload it to the GPU while we are generating this precipitation occlusion screen space pass, and use this to generate a secondary channel that effectively can be seen as a temperature channel. This allows us to have the rain and snow techniques within our pixel shaders to actually add more snow or remove snow based on the temperature. For instance, in the screenshot here, you can see how a cooler has been placed in the world. Even though it's not snowing in the world at all, there is actually ice being generated within the world. Similarly as well, if it would be snowing and a heater is placed down, you would actually see the snow melting in the surrounding area, which is all driven by this precipitation occlusion map. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in this case study is perturbation. Now, perturbation is basically a very technical term for what basically means things that move because other things moved. That's all that it means. This might seem like a bit of an unneeded detail for a game that is quite often mostly spent from the distance, but in reality, we actually consider this a very important detail. Again, we are trying to sell this idea that everything is part of this interactive world. In Jurassic World Evolution, players can drive around with a 4x4 in the world and drive through the grass, drive through the water. While in Planet Zoo, you have these players that spend a lot of time building these habitats for their animals and making it look as nice as possible. It only makes sense that these animals would actually interact with their habitats. So how do we go about this? It's again a simple top-down texture that we render. I'm sure you can see the theme here in this case study. But instead of this time rendering any types of objects that can occlude, this time we render any objects that move. You can kind of see this as a type of velocity map, except we render some extra data, such as flags that define what it is of the object that has moved, so we can turn certain things on and off based off of what it is. Here in this video, you can see an example of a player driving the 4x4 through the world. You can see how it moves the grass out of the way, and when they enter the water, you get these water splashes that get created, you get water ripples off in the water that all get simulated. All of these are completely separate systems that simulate all of this, but they are all driven by the perturbation map, and they all have this set of data that is there. For instance, the water ripples uses a full simulation that actually propagates the ripples and everything. It's really cool, but that would almost be a talk on its own, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Now, let's move on to our third case study, indirect lighting and reflections. So I'm sure you understand the common theme of this talk by now, that basically everything is dynamic. Our indirect lighting and our reflections are no exception to this. We can't rely on any type of baked global illumination. We can't rely on light maps or anything like that. It all has to happen at runtime. So as a result, we have to combine various different techniques in order to get somewhat of an idea of indirect lighting and reflection. So let's start off by talking about our indirect lighting. So this is primarily driven by cube maps that have been rendered by probes that are placed within the world. We try to re-render these probes as often as possible, but of course, again, a lot of these probes, fully dynamic geometry, we have to be careful about how we do this. We can't just simply re-render all of the probes all the time. So we actually spread the rendering of these over multiple frames. For instance, for one point, we tend to do one face at a time and then do an extra frame for any type of processing, such as GGX convolution or anything like that. Now, in order to support our various lighting bits, we actually have got three different types of probes. We've got the global atmospherics, the global diffuse, and the local specular. So let's start off with the global atmospherics. This is the simplest one of them all. There is only a single one of these in the world, and the only thing that it renders is the sky, nothing else. Now, this is often placed from a viewpoint somewhere in the center of the level, high up, and we try to render this one as often as possible. We've even got, it basically has priority over all other points. The reason for this is that even though the other probes might take longer to render, by re-rendering this one as often as possible with all of our lighting constantly changing, we ensure that we always have some sort of sensible fallback that we can rely on that at least gets the general idea of the lighting across. Say, for instance, if it's daylight, you get the nice blue light bleeding into your indirect lighting. If it's night, you don't really want that in your lighting. So we try to update it as often as possible. Oh, sorry. One thing, however, that you'll note about this point is if you look at this screenshot, if you look at the bottom of it, it's got quite this white, gray, bluish tint to it. But if you look at the screenshot of the scene, you can see how the ground level is actually more green than it is white, bluish. This is because one of our largest sources of indirect lighting is our terrain. Almost all of our games are placed within the terrain and the user is modifying a section of the terrain. So the terrain provides a lot of contributions. So how do we deal with that? We've got a secondary point called the global diffuse. Now, the global diffuse is similar to the global atmospherics, where there's only a single point of these within the world, and it also tries to re-render as often as possible. But instead of just re-rendering the sky and the terrain, it only renders the terrain and actually samples the global atmospherics point for its sky so that we don't have to pay the cost of rendering the sky again. Now, this capture point is the one that we tend to, that we end up convolving, GGX convolving for our PBR lighting workflow for all of the diffuse image-based lighting. So you can see how in this one, the bottom of it has a lot more of that green contribution, which is significantly more representative of our general indirect lighting within our scene than the global atmospherics is. Now on to the local specular. This is the fun one. So this is a very special one that is completely different than all of the others. So unlike the global ones, the local specular ones, there's actually a lot of these in the world. So we build a two-dimensional grid of these probes within the world. We don't do any type of 3 dimensions because that would be too costly to render. Instead, we do a 2-dimensional grid, but use the height map data and use the data from all of the buildings that have been placed to offset these points up or down in order to guarantee that they are never intersecting with the terrain or are never within a building and always still get a general idea. So where the global atmospherics only rendered the sky and the global diffuse only rendered the terrain, the local specular actually renders the surrounding scene in the type of way that you would normally expect from a local capture probe. So we don't keep all of these probes alive because that would cost way too much memory. In some levels, you can have thousands of these points trying to keep a cube map that is dynamically rendered at runtime that you can't compress in memory would be a bit too expensive. So instead, we just keep track of which of these points are closest to the camera and basically just constantly re-render those and evict any of the ones that aren't supported from memory. Now, I've already talked about how we convolve our diffuse, but our specular, we don't convolve them at all. Well, we don't convolve these specific points because that will be significantly too expensive. Instead, what we do is we again take the closest ones to the camera and actually blend them together based off the camera position. So we can always capture the 3 points closest to the camera in a triangle and use barycentric interpolation to interpolate between those. And then we convolve that. One thing you'll have noticed from the previous screenshot, however, is that the sky was magenta. So where's the sky in all this? Because these probes take significantly longer to render because we have to spread them across frame, we don't render the sky in them at all, and we actually render a chroma key in them along the color of magenta. And then we composite in the global atmospherics environment map into this after we have blended, just before we do the convolve. This ensures that even if the rendering of the scene may not be entirely up to date, the rendering of the sky within this will be entirely up to date. So by the time that we have convolved, it will still have an accurate lighting representation. Now for our reflections, most of our reflections, we use screen space reflections. The reasoning for this is that, as I've already alluded to, we have to be careful with geometric complexity. Since screen space reflection is a technique that is not bound by geometric complexity and is purely bound by resolution, it means that it's a very interesting technique for us. Now, one of the big downsides of screen space reflection, of course, is that you can have missing information, you can have gaps, because you can only reflect what has already been rendered on the screen. So for that, if we have a point that does not have any information, we actually fall back to the post-blended local specular maps that I've talked about before, so that we always have some kind of reflection there. We have found that even though these reflections aren't entirely accurate, it is far better to have reflections that somewhat get the idea across, as opposed to having reflections that are completely accurate, especially in a game with our type of art styles and the games that are so constantly moving and constantly changing. Here you can see screen space reflection disabled on the left, and on the right you can see it enabled, where you can see the reflections in the water on the floor. So we try to use it mostly just for subtle reflections. We try to avoid highly reflective surfaces. For our water, we use planar reflections. This is, again, a technique that's been used a lot of times before. This is effectively just rendering the world upside down using a special projection matrix. The downside of this technique, however, is that it is very expensive. So what we found is that we could only render one of these for a single water body within the world. But of course, our player can place down as many water bodies as they want. So we have a lot of water bodies that end up not having reflections. If they're zoomed up close, that's not too bad. If they're zoomed out far, that's not ideal. So we have a second reflection technique, screen space planar reflections. The idea here is very similar to screen space reflections, only reflects based off of what has already been rendered on the screen. The difference between screen space reflections and screen space planar reflections is that you can take a lot of optimizations with screen space planar reflections, because you know that you are reflecting from a purely flat surface as opposed to whatever surface the user has placed down. So in our case, this is very interesting because, again, it's not geometric complexity bound, because unlike this, the planar reflections. And as a result, we can render reflections for way more water planes than planar reflections do. So these days, we tend to prefer screen space planar reflections over planar reflections. As I've alluded to before, it is far better to have some kind of information on reflections there that might potentially be wrong, as opposed to having no reflection at all. So here you can, for instance, see them side by side. So you can see how the trees reflecting actually has quite a lot of missing information. But again, it gets the idea across of the scene. So this is what we are after. So what does all of this mean? What is it that I've been trying to say here? So first of all, don't underestimate how multiple techniques working together can actually achieve a nicer result than trying to find this one solution that fits every single problem that you're trying to solve. Don't be afraid to combine them, mix and match, see what works, see what you have available to you. Second of all, don't always aim for the most accurate technique either, like with our screen space reflections, screen space planar reflections. It is better to have some information there than no information at all. Not only that, it can often work better if you have a more constrained or a more specific visual style as well, as we tend to have within our games at Frontier Developments. And of course, the more detailed a technique is, the more easier it is to spot problems because you end up in that uncanny valley type scenario. Players will feel that it's wrong. So sometimes it's nicer to have just some general information there instead. Don't just use the latest technique because you saw this cool paper on it and just go like, ooh, that's cool, I'm going to use that in my production. Think about, does it fit within your game? Does it work for the type of game that you are trying to create? Does it make sense for how your players interact within your worlds and how it all works together? Does it potentially conflict with any of your other techniques that you might have already implemented? And see if there's anything that you can potentially use. We very much rely on taking existing papers and adapting them to fit our needs because we're not trying to solve conventional problems within our games. And last, and I cannot stress this enough, please always keep performance in mind. Please. It's so important to make sure that your rendering is a nice, smooth experience and it works nicely across all of your platforms. Just because a technique is really nice, really shiny, and it looks great doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right idea to spend like half of your frame budget on it. Think about what else am I trying to achieve in a scene and where do I potentially have to maybe, cut some things short in order to be able to fit some other things in there as well. So lastly, I want to thank the render team at Frontier for always having crazy ideas and always remaining creative with all of our solutions. The amount of times that we go, ha ha ha, wouldn't this be silly? Actually, so it's a great team to work in. We always love bouncing ideas back and forwards, and it's always loads of fun. So thank you for them. I want to thank all of our developers at Frontier, making sure that all of our games are always like the best they can be and really like taking all these crazy complexities to the next level. But last but not least, I want to thank our player base for continuing to create these amazing parks and for really allowing us to create these types of games that allow us to take this to the next level and to never stop bringing us these technical challenges because we love solving them. So yeah. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions? Oh, there's one over there.
Hey, so I'm interested in, have you engaged with ray tracing much for this engine? And if you haven't, like what optimizations do you think you could get out?
Yeah. So we do have support for ray tracing. So on Jurassic World Evolution 2, we shipped with hardware accelerated ambient occlusion ray tracing. So we have experimented with that. It was a very interesting challenge to solve. We had to do a lot of changes to our model rendering structure in order to guarantee that we could appropriately deal with the TLAS and BLAS building within this, because again, fully dynamic scene, it's not a problem to solve, not an easy problem to solve. So yes, it was a large technical challenge, but we do support it, yes.
Okay, so I have 1,000 questions, but I'll keep it to one. For the landscape, is it just voxel or is it some sort of hybrid?
So a bit of both. It is primarily voxel based. But for our games that we know that we're not going to be supporting tunneling, we fall back to a hybrid system that allows us to take a bit more easier solutions, like certain optimizations, because we know we won't tunnel. But at the core of it, it is voxel based, yes.
Yeah. And then being cheeky, height limit wise, is there anything like that?
Yes, but it's a lot. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but in true fashion with our changes, the limit is a lot.
Until it crashes, yeah. Sweet.
It doesn't crash, no, it works, but
Yeah, no, I mean, like, if the player goes nuts, then
oh no,
so
we
be
just
it, yeah.
limit it within the editing tools.
Okay,
we just limit the heights.
Sweet, thank you very much.
Are your reflection probes rendering depth into the buffer, or is it just a diffuse lighting in them so that you can blend them together?
No, so we are a forward-based renderer. So our probes also just use a standard forward-based rendering technique. So with a depth pre-pass and everything, we just rely heavily on having good culling techniques to try to limit the performance impact of what we're trying to do. Okay, cool. That is it for time that we have for questions. If you do have any more questions, try to catch me outside or at the Frontier Development booth. 820, I believe, is where we're at. So I'm always up for more chats. So feel free to catch me there. Thank you very much.